Hi everyone. Well, it's a big week for Australian Lyme patients this week because the results of the 2025 Senate inquiry are going to be handed down tomorrow. This inquiry is a follow-up from the 2016 inquiry, which was into the treatment and diagnosis of patients with tick-borne illness. At the end of that inquiry, a list of recommendations was made, which Lyme disease patients in Australia argue has made things worse for them. The point of this new inquiry is to investigate whether those recommendations that were made have been implemented effectively, and to also investigate the diagnosis and access to treatment for Lyme patients in Australia today versus what it was back in the last inquiry in 2016, and whether it's made things better or worse. Just a bit of a disclaimer, these opinions are mine as a Lyme patient who has spent a lot of time researching this topic as it impacts me every day. And I am in no way a doctor or medical professional. These opinions are my own. We are hopeful for the results of this inquiry. However, we've been hopeful before and it didn't happen. But fingers crossed this time it will. The senators that were involved with the live inquiry, which is available on the Parliament House YouTube channel, were very good at asking questions. And in particular, I'd just like to read a quote from Senator Linda Reynolds, who was involved with the first inquiry and this one. She says, "After having been looking at this for many years now, meaning tick-borne illness, to me it almost seems like a cult," she said. "For some reason, the medical profession and those who are senior representatives in the department and other organisations, they have for some reason over many years got themselves into this psychology where it is a cult, and if anybody speaks out against it or says something different, they look for ways to invalidate and persecute." And that is 100% spot on, in my opinion. As a Lyme patient, it's very hard to find any doctor in Australia who will talk to you about tick-borne illness at all. And there are many patients with tick-borne illness who have had doctors who would talk to them about it and help them with treatment. And then those doctors lost their medical licenses. So there's a lot of work still needs to be done for us to have acknowledgement and just be treated like humans in the medical system and not straight away get written off as a patient with a psychiatric issue just because we have a tick-borne illness. We shouldn't be discriminated against based on the illness that we have. So fingers crossed, this new inquiry will make a difference to patients like us. I should also add that in Australia, a lot of the argument around tick-borne illness centres around, do Australian ticks carry tick-borne illness or not? In cases like mine, I got bitten overseas in what is now known as an endemic area in America. Those of us who have been bitten overseas are caught up in the same debate and same arguments as patients who have been bitten here in Australia, even though we know that the ticks we got bitten by do carry the disease, which is something that we find hard to deal with, as well as the Australian patients. All of us are just caught up in this mess. What I'd like to do in this video is give you a bit of insight into those 2016 recommendations and look a bit more closely at some of them. There were 12 recommendations. I'm not going to go through each of them individually because that will just take way too long. But I'm going to go through the ones that I think are the most important and relevant to us today so that you have a bit of an understanding before the new recommendations are announced, and then I'll do another video after I see those recommendations. The first thing I'd like to say is that I actually don't think the recommendations that were made in the last Senate inquiry were that bad. The issue has been the implementation of those recommendations by the Australian government and the way some of them seem to have diverted from what was initially intended. The other issue that has come up is the naming of the illness. So it was decided after that inquiry that instead of calling it what it is, which is Lyme disease, or looking at other umbrella terms such as tick-borne illness, vector-borne illness, Lyme-like illness, it was decided for some reason to call it debilitating symptom complexes attributed to ticks, or DSCAT. I am yet to go to any doctor who understands that term. And I can't understand why that was picked. We wouldn't say cancer was debilitating symptom complexes attributed to cancer cells. It just is quite derogatory, and every Lyme patient I've spoken to agrees with that. But if you hear me talk about DSCAT in this video, that's what the term is. So I'll start with the recommendations now. There's two main ones I want to concentrate on. The first one is the research funding. It was announced, and I'm quoting this from the recommendations, that the committee recommends Australian government increase funding for research as a matter of urgency. And we thought that was absolutely fantastic. Funding was being allocated. We thought it was going towards diagnosis and treatment of these illnesses in Australia, which is what was outlined in the recommendations. There was $3 million allocated, and now we're years on, and the results of the studies that were allocated the funding have started to be announced. And Australian Lyme patients are just gobsmacked by what has happened with that funding. So the first funding allocation was $2 million to Murdoch University. Now, that research has just been handed down, and can you believe that with $2 million, they researched a whole 6 Lyme patients and came to this conclusion that tick bites may cause long-lasting changes in the immune system and metabolism. Well, we already knew that prior to the research happening. Lyme patients have been saying this for years. So there is no life-changing scenario that has come down from that research as far as Lyme patients are concerned. The second amount, which is $1 million, was allocated to a university to research cognitive, behavioural, and acceptance and commitment therapy. Again, this was a very, very small sample size that was used, and it doesn't address the physical issues of Lyme disease. It comes at it from a psychosocial perspective. Now, we were all confused by that too, but the researcher was brought into the 2025 Senate inquiry and asked a lot of questions. And when they dug more deeply into what this treatment entailed, he gave an example, and the example we were just absolutely offended and shocked at. The example he gave was that as part of this, they would like people to return to pleasurable activities. So he said that if someone who's ill may have stopped doing the things that they enjoy because they don't feel well enough, and they might be concerned that they're getting in the way of their recovery, they would encourage a return to those activities. And then he said, let's just say someone who stopped walking their dog, well, we would encourage them to start walking their dog again. I wish it were that simple. For most of us, simply being told that we should just walk our dog is not a solution to the problem of our Lyme disease symptoms in any way, shape, or form. We wish we were well enough to stand up and do that, but for a lot of us, our legs don't work and we can't physically stand up and we can't physically walk anywhere. But instead of the research funding addressing that, it's addressing the psychosocial effects that exist instead. So basically, there's $3 million of funding that was allocated to tell us what we already know and to investigate things that are not giving us diagnosis or treatment, which is what we need. So in my opinion, the implementation of that recommendation was absolutely a fail, and I think a waste of money, and could have been done much, much better in a way that would impact us as patients and make our journey much easier. The other recommendation that I would like to talk about, that I also have lots of opinions on, is this one. The committee recommends that government medical authorities, in consultation with stakeholders, including the Australian Chronic Infectious and Inflammatory Diseases Society and Carl McManus Foundation, establish clinical trials of treatment guidelines developed by the Australian Chronic Infectious and Inflammatory Diseases Society with the aim of determining a safe treatment protocol for patients with tick-borne illness. Now, again, I would argue nothing wrong with the recommendation itself, other than the Lyme Disease Association of Australia weren't included, and I think they should have been. But the Australian Chronic Infectious and Inflammatory Diseases Society were, I think, the perfect choice to make these guidelines. They deal with around 4,000 patients like us each year, and they're the doctors that do so much research on their own time into these illnesses and really have a strong understanding of them. But what happened was the Australian government instead decided to hire an outside consultancy firm to put together the recommendations. These recommendations then formed into what is now known as the debilitating symptom complexes attributed to ticks clinical guidelines. And Lyme patients across Australia argue that these guidelines have made things so much worse for them since they were implemented. Now, let's start with the fact that the DSCAT clinical pathway is designed to help doctors diagnose and treat tick-borne illness in Australia. However, the document itself says multiple times that DSCAT is not a clinical diagnosis. So we have a document designed to diagnose something that isn't a clinical diagnosis. I know it's confusing. It's confusing for all of us living it as well, but that is what has happened. Now, there are numerous issues with this DSCAT clinical pathway as far as patients are concerned, and there's a few of those I'm going to bring up today, but I can assure you there's a lot more than what I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to give you some examples now so you can see the kind of confusion that comes from these guidelines that have been put together. So firstly, the clinical pathway states that in order to get a diagnosis, a patient must have laboratory evidence and clinical evidence and epidemiological evidence. Now, this is impossible because there is no laboratory test that is 100% accurate. In fact, some of them are only 33% accurate. And when you do have a positive blood test, as I do, quite often they're just written off as a false positive blood test. So it's impossible to get those results at all. Also, only up to 70% of Lyme patients ever get the rash that comes hand in hand with Lyme disease. It's a bullseye rash, but not all patients get that. So requiring that as part of a diagnosis is not fair to Lyme patients in general and is not accurate. The guidelines also require that at the time of presentation to a doctor that you can show your tick site and also that you can show your rash. Now, again, as I said, a lot of people don't get the rash. There's a lot of people that don't realise they've been bitten by a tick. And for patients like me who got bitten 20 years ago, we don't still have a tick-borne site that you can see, and we don't still have evidence of the rash because that was so many years ago. Now, back when I got bitten, there was no digital cameras and phone cameras and things like that. So I never took a picture of the rash because I didn't know it was something that was going to be relevant and serious 20 years on. But that's what's required under these guidelines. And they're just a couple of inconsistencies in the document. I've found many more, and if you're interested, the Senate inquiry page where I put forward my submission has those inconsistencies in it, as well as numerous other patients who have put forward inconsistencies with this document as part of the Senate submissions, and they are all publicly available. But even basic facts like the document states that tick-borne illness cannot be transmitted from person to person, yet the CDC, which is the major equivalent body in America to the AMA, actually says, yes, it can be transmitted from person to person, and they have evidence of this happening. The CDC also recommend against tick-borne illness patients donating blood for fears of transmission from person to person via the blood. Australian guidelines do not have that in them. I'm just going to touch briefly on a few other recommendations that were made, and these are that a summit be held to develop multidisciplinary approaches to tick-borne illness, that federal, state and territory health agencies work together to develop a consistent approach, that optimization of diagnostic testing be developed, and that the Australian Health Department work closely with the Royal College of General Practitioners to ensure GPs have better understanding of how to treat patients. Now, the government response to all this is that all of these have been done because they introduced those DSAT clinical pathways that I was talking about earlier, which I've just explained were a serious issue in themselves. When the Lyme Disease Association approached the then Health Minister with concerns about the way the recommendations have been rolled out, his response was, I'm satisfied the clinical pathway and educational materials currently being developed do not constitute a risk to patients' health or safety. Now, that to me is absolutely amazing that that is the statement, because every Lyme patient in Australia would argue the exact opposite. Our health and safety have been put at risk. The health and safety of patients who get bitten in the future have been put at risk. And we've been left to get sicker and sicker while all these recommendations have been implemented, I believe, inadequately. And it'll be very interesting to see what the Senate inquiry finds on Wednesday when this is all handed down. Now, ironically for me, when the results are actually handed down, I will be having treatment in Cyprus because I can't get access to treatment in Australia as a result of the clinical pathway that was developed in 2016. And not only that, the Australian government advises against travelling overseas to undergo treatment like what I'm about to have, because they say there's adequate resources available in Australia, which I am yet to find. So this inquiry will be extremely interesting for patients like me who are in the late stages of Lyme disease and have irreversible symptoms and irreversible damage done. This inquiry is probably too late to have a huge significant impact on us, other than hopefully we'll get treated with respect and be able to be treated in our own country. But for any new patients that get tick bites or those who have only recently been bitten, hopefully this will be a change and enable them to get treatment so that they don't get as sick as what myself and other late stage patients are now. Like I said, once the results have been handed down, I will do a video to let you know what has come about and what the recommendations are. And hopefully these recommendations will be implemented a bit more carefully than I believe the last lot were. Like I said at the start of the video, everything in this is my opinion as a patient who has lived with this for many years, waited 10 years for a diagnosis, in which time I got sicker and sicker and sicker, and still unable to get help in Australia for an illness that has been proven and believed throughout the rest of the world. So fingers crossed, this Senate inquiry will be a step in the right direction for Lyme patients, and I will keep you posted. If you do have any questions, feel free to comment below, and if I can, I will try and answer them. The Lyme Disease Association of Australia also has some amazing information if anyone wants more on their website, including their response to the last Senate inquiry as well. So thank you for watching, and hopefully we will get some action this week.